Hello and welcome to the Miko Bits show, and I'm your host, Miko Bits. Today we have John Reynolds, who is helping to run the ZPrize competition, which is the sophisticated contest, a bit like the X Prize that's used for advanced technology, only this is really focused on enhancing the industry's use of zero knowledge proofs and the new mathematics of cryptography. So excited to have you here. Thanks for joining the show, John.
Thank you so much for having me, Miko. Yeah, super excited to chat a little bit about ZPrize today.
Yeah, that's great. So first of all, help me understand and the audience a little bit about what is the Z Prize? How did it get started? And what's the purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. The main point of ZPrize is to help push the industry of zero knowledge forward as much as possible. And so this obviously, goes across a variety of different verticals from hardware and software and so forth. And so what we've done in the first version of ZPrize, so ZPrize 2022, we curated a set of different categories and aligned with some of the industry experts to create test harnesses and provide a competition for people to try and surpass the previous baselines that existed for some of these different categories. And this helped, push the industry forward quite a bit from a hardware perspective. And then this year, again, we're curating some different categories to help individuals focus on specific areas of the industry that are going to continue to push it forward and make it more realistic to introduce this in more scalable and widespread applications.
So there is a prize. So I'm sure people want to know like how much is the prize?
Yeah, so this year we have a total of three categories. Each one, for now, the baseline is starting at $300,000, and it's a winner takes all. So each
Great.
category will have, a basis in the spec for what the winning number or the winning value or speed will be, and again, the winner takes all. So it's a pretty cool opportunity, and super excited, yeah, to see what the results kind of bear as a result of the larger prize that we've put in front of the competitors.
And how many categories are there?
Three categories this year. So we have two that are focused on beating the best from last year. These two are focused on MSM, so lower level primitives within the zero knowledge proof, to help expedite those processes and ultimately try and make the full workflow of the zero knowledge proof generation faster.
So from the for the audience, in this case, MSM actually stands for multiscalar multiplication, which is one of the base mathematics that actually drives an entire class of zero knowledge proof. So it doesn't stand for mainstream media, which is, if you're in social media and you see MSM, like, get ready for the conspiracies to pop. So like, this is a different kind of MSM, and so that's interesting. So those are two different prizes that are focused on accelerating multiscalar multiplication, which is exciting. So like, uh, what's the other prize for?
One more thing to kind of note on that is it is also doing it on specific hardware platforms, so FPGA or GPU. So that'll kind of diversify some of the results. And then the other prize category is a high throughput signature verification. So this one's actually sponsored by Aleo, and they're looking to have a non-native signature verification expedited within a zero knowledge circuit. And so this is more of an application based category. So very interested to see the results from this and some of the impacts that it kind of provides to the industry too.
Got it. So, I think everybody knows what a GPU is, a graphics card, but like the other one is FPGA, which is field programmable gate array. And it's basically a chip that effectively allows you. So the concept of field programmable means that end users can basically do something that makes this more like an ASIC or application specific integrated circuit. So just to kind of explain that, right, which is that when you look at something like Bitcoin mining, just for the audience, right? The Bitcoin miners actually use something called an ASIC, which is an application specific. It's specific for Bitcoin, right? And it turns out that computing SHA-256 and this kind of Bitcoin sort of encryption, it's very, very, very fast at doing that one thing, right? So that's application specific, the application being Bitcoin, right? So the thing that's interesting about this is that FPGA allows you to in the field, meaning not at the factory or the chip fabricator. You can actually tune a piece of chip so that it really does beautifully well on a specific algorithm. So in this case, FPGA and running multiscalar multiplication on top, right? So just to kind of deconstruct some of this lingo for you, it's really like, what are the best ways to make this thing blazingly fast, right? And so John, you also work at Aleo, right? And so I'm curious about the sponsorship of this kind of sort of signature. So I'm curious how does it work, and what's the use case?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really great point to bring to the attention, I think, of the audience. So, proof of knowledge is really powerful and meaningful. It provides us the ability to prove we have some secret or maybe we have some information without having to reveal that. The one thing that it doesn't come with is proof of identity. And so, we have to be able to relate these claims around proof of knowledge with some sort of identity that's actually claiming that to know that secret or to know the knowledge. And so the signatures allow us to introduce a source of truth to some form of information or message and provide it to a party that we're sending something to. And signature verification then means that we can verify some secret came from some individual, which gives us proof of knowledge and proof of identity without revealing the underlying information if this is happening within a zero knowledge circuit.
Great. So what I did want to do is kind of peel it back for the audience, right? Which is that we keep talking about this whole concept of like ZK proof, AKA zero knowledge proof, right? And I think one of the cool things that I saw online was an MIT professor that actually showed how you can play a game of Where's Waldo, and you can basically prove that you know where Waldo is without telling the other person actually the solution, right? So that's really almost a silly version of what a zero knowledge proof, right? And what you're saying is basically that that's the characteristic of what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a proof of knowledge, right? Which is you know something, right? And you have to prove that you know something, right? But you don't want to give away what that is, right? So in a sense, that's this sort of MIT professor playing this Where's Waldo is sort of the academic case, right? That's an explanation of a type of use case. One of the questions that I have that's kind of it's pretty intriguing, right? Which is that in traditional cryptography that's not ZK, right? There's a wonderful concept that's really just kind of like this typical public key cryptography, right? So in the public key cryptography, there's this concept of the private key, right? And so the thing that's interesting is that a digital signature in a traditional context of this kind of asymmetric cryptography, like essentially you have something where the private key itself is the secret, right? So in a sense, like the knowledge becomes a knowledge of the private key. So I guess my question is isn't that just a degenerate case of what you're describing? Is you're describing arbitrary knowledge that isn't a private key, right? But in a sense, like if you have the knowledge that you're trying to prove that you have be the private key itself, then you're back to just signatures. Or am I missing something?
So no, you're correct. But the key point that differentiates is that the zero knowledge proof actually provides proof of computation. So it provides you the ability to prove that some value was computed to a result, or it provides you the ability to prove that computation happened honestly. And so within that zero knowledge circuit, if you have a signature verification included there, you can prove that you're providing a message as a private input, you're providing a public key, and you're providing the signature itself. we can then verify the validity of that signature within the zero knowledge circuit without needing the private key, of course. But the zero knowledge proof then that is the result of this computation, computed as a result of this computation, proves that it received an input, made the computation that's defined within the circuit, and then output some true or false value or the something related to the validity of the signature. So as long as the proof is able to be verified, then we can be sure that the signature verification computed from inputs provided by a user and created the defined outputs.
Got it. Okay, that's definitely makes sense. I guess to me, the thing that I'm quite interested in is the sort of application use cases that diverge from the digital signature application use cases, right? Because in a sense, like people can do quite a lot of cool things just with digital signatures, traditional cryptography, right? So I'm wondering, like, what are the new use cases that kind of go beyond? Like, you're really talking about verification of compute and verification of data, presumably.
Correct. Yeah. So the biggest thing is you have a lot more expressiveness with the data, and you have a lot more control over what you want to show somebody or not show somebody in the instance of proving. I think that this really bleeds over into identity the best. It's something that's really easy to understand and relate to. So, like for instance, right now we have a lot of centralized providers who hold a lot of our identity information,
Yes.
and they act as honeypots, right? So attackers look at these centralized database repositories, and they think of ways that they can exploit them because there's a lot of value that's possessed within them.
Yes.
Um, if we think about decentralized identity, trying to separate out ownership of the credentials and making it a more user-centric experience, we diversify ownership, we separate, single points of failure, and we create a attack surface that's much larger and harder to, exploit. Um, but we're still dealing with situations where all of that information has to get shared with third parties, and then there's transparency concerns, data breach, leaks, so on and so forth. And so, what zero knowledge proofs kind of introduce now is, we have the opportunity to avoid this situation where we're eliminating all the privacy for the user by giving their information to third parties transparently, but also we aren't going to be damaging businesses and regulatory compliance by providing complete anonymity and privacy without any verification. We can combine these two, privacy and compliance, these things that have been kind of at odds with one another, and we can create a system that verifies information so the business meets the regulatory needs and does this completely privately. So they don't ever see the user's information. They have the cryptographic guarantees. The way this is done is, a user is issued credentials. They have these in their wallet. They locally receive a request from some verifying party that has maybe a zero knowledge circuit defined in it. They provide their credentials to that program locally, compute the zero knowledge proof, and then they can provide that result back to the verifier. The verifier can be certain that they're getting the information they need, the user meets the access criteria, and as a result, the user gets access but doesn't have to give up any of his personal information.
Yeah, yeah. So I think you're describing something that is actually quite intriguing, right? Because to me, what you're speaking to is something that's utterly foundational within the Web3 movement, right? So the thing that I think is quite fascinating is we went through a sort of cyclical wave of innovation around so-called blockchain technologies, right? We went through waves of things like tokenization. We went through waves of decentralization, all kinds of mechanisms around sort of assets, right? So digital assets and the transfer of digital assets, that very, very interesting technologies and very beneficial, right? But the thing that I think you're suggesting is that this new technology of zero knowledge proofs can actually contribute materially both to the advancement of the movement of assets, but also this idea of data as well as identity, as well as privacy, right? And that to do it in a way that really can be a foundational internet infrastructure, right? So I think that, we had a very nice talk with Lagrange. So, we spoke with Ismail from there, and we were talking about essentially Web3, right? So, if you want to check it out on my YouTube channel, like, please feel free to. But, we were talking about basically Web 2, right? Which is essentially that Web 2 has kind of obviously failed, right? And I think that when you look at Elon Musk, he kind of bought Twitter with this sort of like ethos of free speech absolutism, right? Which is sort of provably not feasible, right? Like in a sense, like, the United States Constitution is not absolutist about free speech, right? Like, there's definitely speech that, like, that can, be problematic, right, from a legal perspective,
Sure.
right? So I guess what I'm really suggesting is like you're really talking about the ability for an infrastructure to balance the needs of a group of people while preserving the needs of individual people, right? So it's sort of like so the need for an individual to be able to preserve their privacy, but also the needs for the, collective to be able to, provide a modicum of security against crime, fraud, terrorism, money laundering, and things that, generally people dislike, probably should, right? So, um, yeah, so I think that's exciting, right? So that's definitely an exciting characteristic of this, an application of this technology, right? Which is a really deep internet infrastructure. So I guess one of the questions I'd love to ask you in particular is sort of where are we in the scalability of this infrastructure? Because I think that what we need internet scale, right? So we need mega scale in terms of the ability to perform these mathematics, and we need to do so at a cost that isn't astronomically prohibitive, right? So where would you say we are with respect to achieving, what are the benchmarks that we think are good enough for internet scale, and how do you see this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. We're certainly not at a place quite yet where this can be scaled into, every application and can be very easily integrated. There are challenges, which is one of the reasons ZPrize exists. Um, I think, we are still a ways away from seeing this in large scale production applications to an extent. But I also think that there's a lot of improvements that we've seen in the last decade alone. And I think that there's a lot of movement, especially thanks to Web3, but also in the hardware space. We've seen a lot of, AMD themselves are technology providers for ZPrize, so they're providing their hardware resources to help the
Is
competitors.
there a way to quantify where we are though? Like I'm really curious
I, you know,
about
I,
the
I mean, I
benchmark.
don't. That's yeah.
What are
I
the
don't.
goals, right? Like, like I guess what I would say from a goals perspective is that you've got benchmarks, you've got prize winners, right? And the thing that's real interesting is I'd love to understand the thresholding, right? Because the thresholding is really something like, oh, like for example, if you look at thresholding, right? If you look at a thresholding around something like packet routing, right? So when you look at packet routing, you're like, okay, well, what is the ping? Like, what is the ping for? And, obviously the answer is depends on the application, right? But for
Yeah,
example, something like, uh, in a gaming application, right? Like a ping of sub 40 milliseconds is probably sub perceptual for most people, right? And so the thing that's quite interesting is, you kind of want to understand application characteristics that are acceptable or unacceptable, right? So I think that those are the kinds of ideas. So for me, the thing that I think is probably a logical threshold is to look at the orders of magnitude of the likely requirements for this verification, right? So if it's a true internet infrastructure, then essentially every time you have to authenticate, you're going to need to perform this compute, right? So then the question becomes, how much does that cost? Like, does it cost $1? Does it cost $10? Does it cost $100? Does it cost 10 cents? 10 cents might not be good enough, right? I mean, if you have a billion users, 10 cents adds up pretty fast, especially if people do it 30 times a day, right? So I guess so I'm just trying to get a
sure.
vague feeling of like, are we there yet? I mean, it's a childish question.
No, no. I think it's a good question, and I think it's one that it's one that an important one to ask. I think that there are things that we are there for. There are things, especially around identity and credentials. If we're using native signature schemes, if we're using the native hash schemes, then there are right now ways for us to
So,
execute
so,
these
so,
forms
so
of.
explain
Yep.
explain to the audience that distinction of native. So, how do you,
Okay,
as
yeah.
opposed
So
to non-native?
sure. So, and you may, Mika, you may be even better at describing some of this than me, but the main concept here is there are specific types of signature schemes and hashes that are
Sure.
zero knowledge friendly. This means that they align with the elliptic curve that
Yep.
is that the blockchain or the zero knowledge cryptography is using for Aleo. It's our chain. Um, and so it makes it more efficient to compute these different values that align with these native signatures and the different schemes that relate. So specifically to the primitives that we're using.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely makes sense. And I guess my question becomes, what are the downsides of adopting native, effectively ZK friendly cryptography? Are there any downsides? It feels like the currently popular mechanisms are things like elliptic curve. So, like, people are already using a lot of that type of stuff anyway.
Sure, I think some of the downsides is just the assumption that we're going to be able to get these systems moved over, right? That takes time, and there's a certain level of commitment that we have to have from the different parties who are already using and used to a certain structure. So
So,
legacy systems is going to be maybe a tough part to approach. But one thing I did want to bring up here is that Aleo actually is aiming to support third party proving, which would mean that if you have a specific application that requires more computational power, you could potentially off put that to a third party who has specific computational
for
power
sure.
optimized for that specific proof and application.
So I wanted to talk a little bit. So I was having this conversation with Aaron Greenblatt from Iron Mill. My firm is invested in them, and basically, what we came to this idea of is we're very interested in, as you described, which is GPU class or FPGA class, right? There's obviously the Ngoyama types, who are pursuing, or the Cysics, who are sort of pursuing fundamentally ASIC driven or hybrid ASIC FPGA driven, right? So the thing that I think is foundational about all of these paradigms is the idea of special purpose compute, right? And to me, like, I think it makes a ton of sense, right? If you look at the evolution of something like AI, like, obviously the massively parallel raster vector construct that you see within something like CUDA, which is sort of NVIDIA style graphics cards, right? It's why billions of dollars of those cards are being bought in China right now, because, that hasn't been export restricted yet, but it's about to be. But the bottom line is this, right? Which is that special purpose compute is definitely here to stay, right? And I think the reality is that when you start to actually look at what's happening in microprocessing, it's honestly, I was having a joke with a friend of mine, which is I was talking about 3 nanometer process, right? And so I gave out a tweet that was like, well, after 3 nanometer process, there's 2 nanometer process, and after 2 nanometer process, there's 1 nanometer process, and after that, there's 0 nanometer process, right? And after that, there's -1 nanometer process, right? And that's so power efficient that it actually outputs power and charges up all the other chips on the motherboard without any external like plug-in, right? So it's absurd, right? Like, it's clearly not happening, right? So this whole Moore's law doubling transistor thing is definitely not a thing, right? So then the question becomes, what do you do, right? And in a way, the thing that we've seen in human evolution of the brain is that we've seen a lot of special purpose computing, right? When you actually look at brain anatomy, the brain isn't a monolithic organ, right? Like, the people talk about the brain being an organ. It's kind of almost like calling all of your guts one organ, right? It's like, it's quite absurd, right? Like, when you look at the brain, it's like evolution is provided for lots of special purpose computing, right? And the whole idea of like the visual cortex is structured differently from like the neocortex, right? And so a graphics card is structured differently from a CPU, right? So I guess what I'm really pushing here is like, this narrative that I think is pretty important and especially interesting in the context of XPRIZE, right? Because you have FPGA contests, you have GPU contests, right? You have these different contests that are like designed to encourage the adaptation of these mathematics towards different compute platforms, special purpose compute platforms. So, I think I just wanted to let folks know that this is really going to be a part of the future, and it's definitely going to be. And obviously, the surprise success of NVIDIA with AI, I think, has shown that the power of these appropriate novel compute paradigms that map to infrastructure requirements, I think, is pretty exciting. Um, I guess to me, the thing that's interesting is you're talking about the friction and the cost of replacing old infrastructure. Your partner with AMD on ZPrize. I'm curious about your perspective on things like Secure Enclave, right? Because they're obviously AMD is a proponent of this secure virtualization enclave construct, which is kind of similar to kind of the Intel paradigm, right? So I think SGA. So these kinds of paradigms, SGX. So I'm curious about like how you understand kind of the role of secure enclaves in this kind of verifiable compute world.
Yeah, that's it's a great question, and yeah, again, we're super thankful to have the opportunity to have AMD, partner with ZPrize, and you also mentioned Sisik, and Ingo Nyama, who are both also supporters of ZPrize. Sisik is actually crafting the prize spec for one of the prizes this year. I'm so
Wonderful.
excited to have them. But I actually, I have not specialized in security enclave, so I don't feel like I'm equipped to maybe give the best perspective on that. But I would love to obviously hear more if you want to share a quick snippet about it to educate me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love to kind of let the audience know a little bit about it. So, we do have Lit Protocol, which is one of my portfolio companies that's interested in the use of secure enclaves for applications like key management, right? So it's pretty interesting when you think about it because effectively a secure enclave performs the function of what an enterprise HSM or hardware security model does or module, right? Which is it basically provides essentially like your ledger wallet, right? Which is essentially a piece of hardware wherein the private information is not ever allowed to leave the hardware, right? So it's sort of this very much kind of like, okay, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? It's sort of an enclave philosophy, right? So obviously, like, there's been a lot of criticism of the security of these kind of like on chip enclave type mechanisms or methodologies. But honestly, the uh, reports of all of these bugs when you actually start to dig into them, like, oh, I found a way to compromise this secure enclave, like the things security researchers are doing to compromise the enclaves are insane, right? So they're doing like really crazy like microcapacitance and they're doing all kinds of really insane things that I think are pretty unlikely that you're going to see in the wild, right? Which is, the security researchers have physical access to the hardware, and
Yeah.
it's like very few hackers are going to get physical access to your hardware, right? So I just, I feel like there's a certain layer from which we can say that there's enough security for certain applications, right? And I think one of the things I'm passionate about is a trustworthy internet, and trustworthy internet information, right? And obviously the role of cryptography in generating trust is pretty significant. So I just, to me, like when I think about that, I just think about that some of those use cases just aren't these kind of desperate billion-dollar security use cases, right? They're really more use cases of like, was this video signed by the phone that it was filmed on? And is there a hash of the video that's sitting in an immutable chain so that it's sort of audit worthy, And so like, can we just, what is this, does the phone think that this video was the one that was taken from the CCD, right? And
Sure.
if so, like, it depends on the stakes, right? Like if the phone shows evidence of like, I don't know, political malfeasance or like UFO crashes or whatever, then maybe the stakes are high enough, But I would
Yeah.
say that
Yeah.
like in most cases, internet users will be satisfied, right? So I don't know. There may end up being, I don't know, the internet equivalent of like, blue check marks or something much, much better.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
hope.
we've seen a lot of these deep fakes. It's taking over, with like even the audio now and full videos, and So it is. I mean,
Unbelievable.
I do think this is a direction we're going to need to go in some capacity. Having like signatures for, like you said, things that have maybe more political malfeasance involved and so forth. But yeah, it's really surprising that that it's come to this. And what you were explaining for the security enclave is sounds really very familiar to WASM and a lot of the
Yeah.
architecture we leverage in the browser. Um, and I think like it made me think too, like one of the big things I think going forward that we'll continue to see evolve is user wallets, crypto wallets, also identity wallets, because like you've pointed out, like we can have signature verification or signatures just in general, which are still very valuable and can be used in a lot of creative and meaningful ways. Um, but we can also have those hosted in a wallet that can generate proofs around that and provide the ability to disperse the information in a more controlled manner for the user. And again, I personally think that we're looking towards a future where more user-centric authentication, identification, verification is all going to be put into the user's hands. And so I'm hopeful that we continue to see some of the wallet tech continue to evolve and grow. So people like you and I can be generating zero knowledge proofs on our mobile devices.
I'm very happy with you use the term more, which I just feel is a very nice word, right? Which is we move from the era of something like proof of work, right? To something that might be a little bit softer, honestly. And this kind of idea of things like layer two, scalability, right? Then you have this concept of things like optimism, right? So, like, we move from an era of like trustlessness to an era of trust minimization, right? And to me, the thing that I think this is compatible with is compatible with the cypherpunk ethos going all the way back. So, if you go back to Phil Zimmerman and PGP, right? PGP stands for pretty good privacy, right? And the thing that's so funny about PGP is that there's extant cypherpunks today that have PGP in their email sigs, right? And so it's to me like it's pretty good. And in fact, it's definitely good, right? It's good that people still use it decades later. It's that good, right? So I guess what I'm trying to insist here is that like people need to be better at reasoning about application thresholding, right? So, for example, when you look at something like Bitcoin, right, the idea that there's a wallet that contains, $4.5 billion that like Razzle Khan and her husband can hack out, right? Like, you need more than pretty good, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
you need absolutely industrial grade security, right? You need beyond bank grade security. You need the best security you can get, right? So like that's a very extreme use case, right? But like if you're like is this a real video of Justin Bieber or whatever? Like, what that's not a state level threat actor use case, right? Like, it's not like, oh yeah, like the NSA backdoored this so that they could make a fake video of like Justin, going out with whoever or whatever. Like, I guess what I'm saying is that I don't know. We really do need to come up with mechanisms where people can both trust but also understand the verification, right? That somehow they can understand the level of trust that is enabled by certain technologies, right? And to me, like from an application perspective, like we really need that paradigm. We need the paradigm of good enough, right? It's like, okay, it's good enough for this, right? If you look at something like credit cards, right? There's fraud, right? Credit card fraud is like common. It's super common. And it's why the APY, why people pay such a high percentage rate on credit cards because there's so much fraud, right? But like they just lump it, right? It's almost like optimism. So I guess I'm curious to kind of see how the applications emerge. So from the perspective of applications, I'd love to kind of have you speak to like what are the most kind of predominant applications that are using zero knowledge tech, and what are the kind of candidates? Like, what are the applications where you think, this is going to start taking off soon?
Sure. So I mean, I think we can see like in similar ways that people are thinking about Web3. But more than anything, like I think we're going to see more traditional finance start integrating real financial applications now that we have the ability to introduce privacy. Identity is going to continue to be, I think, a very big focus, and that'll cross over not just from the financial sector, but this could be a value in the healthcare, telemedicine sector. Even you can imagine somebody proving certain things about their health identity or health history to receive medical care if maybe they're in a rural area or somewhere they don't have easy access. They want to still protect the privacy of their information. You can think of from an education perspective, people holding, certificates of their diplomas, wanting to potentially prove that they, got some GPA, but don't want to be excluded from something because they got a bad grade in some semester that they had some personal family issues going on, right? I think there's situations where identity across these different verticals can be leveraged. And I think just generally like authentication and verification is going to continue to grow and support this in a more meaningful way. Because if we're being honest, not just for the user, but we have regulatory compliance requirements that are, I mean, look at the different companies that are being ostracized as a result of some of the security faults that they've had. Massive $1 billion fines to Facebook or Meta. It's pretty
Yes.
crazy. So I think these platforms are being forced not just from like a user demand point of view, but also from a compliance, regulatory, government point of view, saying, "Hey, we demand you to start providing better security and privacy." And hopefully this helps to kind of shift the paradigm
Well, I
to
think
being more user centric. But
the thing that I think is very fundamental about something like Facebook, right, is that you notice that, for example, the new Threads app on top of Instagram, right, was not launched in Europe, right? And basically, it's because of the strength of the European privacy protection laws, right? And I think that that bar is just going to expand internationally because one of the really interesting things about, like, you mentioned privacy and security, right? So the thing that's so funny is that privacy and security definitely travel together, but they're actually kind of different. And the reason why I say it's kind of different is that the fines that Facebook faced are actually not like, so when you think about the characteristics of security fines, a security fine is, oh, you were breached, you were at fault, pay a fine. Right. Whereas in the case of privacy, it's basically like, no, you willfully stole people's data and we told you not to, and you did it again. Right. So that's a pretty different characteristic, right? Which is that,
yeah,
and that's one of the reasons why we think we've reached the end of Web 2, right? Which is that the advertising driven internet is dependent on several characteristics. It's dependent on maximally aggregating data, right? And so the maximal aggregation of data is really only feasible within several like data platforms, right? So when you look at like Facebook is one mega data platform, Google's another mega data platform. There aren't that many mega data platforms because you have to basically suck in everyone's as much information as you can about a person, right? Because the mass of data and then the mass of kind of AI and compute that you can apply gives you the ability to sort of monetize that person, against their will and in breach of a lot of their data privacy rights, right? So I guess I would say that, like, with the privacy regulation increasing, and the other, I think, X factor is the sort of ubiquitization of AI, the mega increase in kind of fake news, fake internet, fake data, and kind of spam bots and troll farms and all these other kinds of things, I think, and deep fakes, I think are really going to kind of trigger a revolution on a desire to change towards the Web3 paradigm. So, I think that's what I'm hopeful for. So, I
yeah,
think
I would agree.
identity.
I'm very
Go ahead.
hopeful for that same. Yeah, yeah.
So,
And I
so
would
what?
say, yeah,
But you were describing a use case about things like university certification, right? But it feels to me like one of the problems with that is actually transferability, right? Which is, if you have a university certificate so you would need to do something like bind a university certificate kind of irrevocably to something like a biometric, right? Because the point being that if you had something like a non-transferable token, right, then you could sell the entire wallet, right? And then all of a sudden I have a PhD from MIT, because I bought the whole wallet, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, there's still an additional need for some kind of legitimate binding towards the physical, the Sybil resistant, like, proof of humanness and the proof of specific humanness.
yeah. No, absolutely. I think more than anything, like the biggest benefit here, and you did a great job of pointing it out, or maybe not the biggest, but one of the biggest that you pointed out was the idea here that you don't have to depend on trusting the entity that's holding your information anymore, right? The centralized entity no longer just gets to choose what they're doing, like in the Facebook situation, behind your back. You have the ability, you have a better ability to understand how your information is being used on some of the third party platforms that you may be sharing information with that aren't meeting the standards that may be set across the board.
Yeah, I do think that we are emerging into a new paradigm of information privacy and security, so I do think that that's pretty exciting. I do think that for sure advertising should and will continue and it performs a valuable function, right? Which is that like I've definitely become aware of products and services that I actually do want to buy through the medium of advertising. So I'm not patently against advertising, but if there is a way, for example, if you look at something like the Brave browser, right? The Brave browser actually does have a privacy paradigm where essentially local compute occurs, right? So basically what happens is advertisers want to advertise to certain types of people, but that the person's data and their browsing habits are actually contained in the local client, right? And so what happens is obviously that without saying who you are, the advertiser actually gets to advertise to someone with specific properties, right? So that feels like a new paradigm, and it feels like something that will kind of fit with your philosophical statement about meeting people's needs, right? Which is you want to meet the needs of individuals and preserve their privacy and their rights, but you also want to meet the needs of the collective, of the interests of the whole. So yeah, I
Definitely.
feel
And
like
that same
it's a great
paradigm
theme.
could be, sorry, I was going to say that zero knowledge proofs could definitely be, it'd be interesting to consider and think through how zero knowledge proofs could be structured in that same kind of paradigm, leveraged as almost cookies in a way, where you're capturing all of that information, then generating a proof around some sort of, maybe uh, training model or something like that that can receive the proof and then decide what this entity might be receiving or might be willing to receive for advertisements.
Yep. I think that's very critical, right? Because ultimately, I believe that the part of this that gets me the most excited is I come from like 30 years of work in Silicon Valley, mostly on open source software. And to me, there's several attributes of open source software that I think are stunning with respect to the internet. I think one of the things that's stunning about it is the use of the commons, right? Which is that economists have postulated this construct called the tragedy of the commons, right? Which is that if there is a commons, like for example, Twitter, right? So is Twitter being overrun by extremists and like troll farms and like, paid shills and all this kind of nonsense? Like for sure, there's definitely bad things going on out there, right? So the thing that I think is interesting is this kind of like, does the commons necessarily need to become degraded and useless and kind of horrifying, right? And so, when you look at things like open source and you look at something like GitHub, like it continues to become sort of almost a reversal of this kind of tragedy, right? So in a sense, it gets better and better, right? Like the software in GitHub by definition is constantly getting better and better, which is kind of astonishing. And to me, the way I reason about it is that if you think about the biodiversity in the biosphere, right, like that keeps getting better and better too. And the reason why it does so is simply that there's an energy source, which is the solar input, right? So to me, the energy source of open source is consent, right? Which is basically that without developers consent to give away their software for free, right? And users consent to use the software because it benefits them, right? So essentially, what makes it better and better, obviously, peer review is huge, right? So peer review is
Well,
very
sure.
big, right? Because how do you define better and better, right? But ultimately, better and better is defined by users, right? That's what makes software amazing, is that an open source amazing, right? So to me, the thing that I wanted to say about this is that what excites me about the cryptography and the infrastructure of Web3 is that it preserves consent in ways that I think are superior to what's happening in Web 2, right? Which is that we have the ability to preserve people's consent around the use of their private data, and we have the ability for users, and if users want to monetize and decloak themselves and be advertised to or do, that's all fine, right? I just feel like we really need to come up with these ways to optimize the infrastructure and kind of participate in this kind of arc of history, right? We need to participate in these kind of cycle of improvement. So, I really appreciate, the work of the ZPrize. I'm really excited to hear about this frontier of zero knowledge proofs. And, I think if you have any other closing comments or thoughts, where can people find you?
Yeah, thank you, Miko, obviously for the time, and it was a really great chat. You can find us on Twitter at ZPrize, also Aleo HQ, and then for myself, Gwei World, like gas on Ethereum, and I'm on Twitter as well.
That's fantastic. Well, really appreciate you joining us and giving us a sample of this exciting new frontier.
Thank you so much for your time. Take care.
Bye.